to it.
We now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5154 in the name of Alistair Allen on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I note that Michael Russell is going to lead the debate because I understand that Dr Allen has been somewhat delayed. Cabinet Secretary, you have 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I notice that my speaking note starts with the word that we all make decisions every day. Those decisions are based on what we know and what we think we know. What I didn't know, even half an hour ago, was that I was going to open this debate. Dr Alistair Allen sends his apologies to this chamber. He has been delayed by the failure of an aircraft on the way from Stornoway. He will be here to sum up the debate, and I offer, just one moment, and I offer my apologies to the chamber for that fact. Please, I take it into consideration.
Alex Johns.
Opportunity to ask the Minister to confirm that the meeting that he and I were supposed to be having at this very minute is therefore postponed.
Well,
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm happy to say it isn't postponed, and you are now late for it. Sorry, the member is now late for it. My officials are taking that meeting, and I hope to join it at some stage with the permission of the chamber if Dr Allen arrives. Presiding Officer, when we don't know, we ask someone else. There's a sense of irony in the speaking note, but we'll get to the facts in a moment. Often someone whose opinion we trust and value. And if we don't agree with an opinion, we debate it in order to change minds or have our own opinions informed. There are many types of evidence, statistical, economic and social, to name but a few. And while public policy decisions have to take a range of different factors into account, it is clear that where good quality evidence exists, it can have and should have considerable influence and importance in terms of public decision-making. Since Alistair Allen became responsible for the science portfolio, he and, of course, I have become acutely aware of the importance of science, engineering and technology to the goals of the government. We've both had the privilege of seeing firsthand some of the wonderful scientific achievements of the university sector, for example. But whilst research undertaken in the university sector can be helpful and sometimes vital in informing policy, the Scottish Government has over 300 directly employed scientists and engineers whose work feeds directly into the policy process. If I may use just one or two examples, scientists in Marine Scotland undertake research and provide scientific and technical advice in support of the Scottish Government's vision of having marine and coastal environments which are clean, healthy, safe, productive and biologically diverse. Last year, they produced Scotland's Marine Atlas, a scientific assessment of the condition of Scotland's seas, and now considered a world leader of its kind. It's an incredible document. I commend it to those who haven't yet seen it. And the scientists in Marine Scotland are perhaps most influential in terms of science input into policy when it comes to the vexed issue of fish stocks and quotas. The work includes the collation of data and stock assessments for international and European scientific advisory bodies, as well as participation in discussions to formulate advice. The guiding principle in negotiating and setting fisheries quotas is always to follow the scientific advice. And that policy is showing results too. Many of Scotland's stocks are now being fished at or close to sustainable rates, and discard rates are falling. To take another example, the work of the Science and Advice for Scottish Agriculture, SASA, helps to ensure quality, safety and security of the food supply in Scotland, and contributes to the overall quality of the environment. Yes, of course.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention. In relation to Marine Scotland and scientific advice, I would certainly agree with everything he had to say, but maybe point out the dangers that sometimes there is a lag in terms of that scientific evidence following through, and therefore it's still incumbent upon politicians to exercise a judgment based on a range of factors when arriving at the policy decisions they take.
I would very much agree with the member, and having had experience as an Environment Minister of dealing with aspects of the fisheries portfolio, I think he puts his finger upon a key issue, and a key issue for this debate too, that while science provides information, it is not absolute. And of course issues of time, issues of cultural connection and other issues need to be taken into account. But SASA, to go back to SASA, is important for Scotland's international reputation. For example, as a producer of very high-quality seed potatoes. And that business is worth £100 million to the Scottish economy. Scientists from SASA co-led negotiations in Brussels during the formation of the new EU directive on potato cyst nematode. They negotiated an agreement to reduce sampling rates in fields where there was a low risk of finding PSN. And this led to a threefold increase in the quantity of soil to be sampled and tested. instead of the tenfold increase that had been proposed, the cost of which would have been simply unacceptable and probably impossible to bear. Now, those are just two instances where the work of highly qualified research scientists and engineers work in-house to support government policy. And there are others, of course, an equally wide range of public bodies across a swathe of disciplines: Historic Scotland, SNH, Transport Scotland, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, the Forestry Commission, Health Scotland, to name but a few. But the government can't have researchers in all areas, and some of the scientific evidence needed to support policy inevitably has to come from elsewhere. Scientific endeavour, by its very nature, can be inherently uncertain. Progression of scientific thinking and understanding relies on open, honest debate about what the results appear to show. In such cases, we need advice on how to interpret the evidence and explain what a degree of uncertainty actually means. And that scientific advice comes from many sources. We have 4 eminent independent advisers in the Scottish Government: Dr Harry Burns, the Chief Medical Officer; Professor Andrew Morris, the Chief Scientist for Health; Professor Louise Heathwaite, the Chief Scientific Advisor for Rural Affairs and the Environment; Professor Murray Calder, the Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland, whom I and Alistair Allen meet regularly. Their role is not only to advise, but also to challenge, and they complement the roles of other advisers, such as the Chief Researcher, the Chief Economist and the Chief Statistician. And of course, we have many specialist science advisers across government working alongside economists, statisticians and social researchers to feed evidence directly into the policy process. And we have 3 centres of expertise in climate change, in water and in animal disease outbreaks. These are virtual centres that bring together expertise across the publicly funded research sector to provide the best available scientific advice to inform government policy in an efficient, accessible and streamlined way. This innovative approach aligns research with the main research providers and aligns it to the wider policy agenda too, and draws resources from across Scotland and from those who are capable of contributing, for example, in the universities. And further to that, we also have the Scottish Science Advisory Council, Scotland's highest level science advisory body, providing independent advice and recommendations on strategy, policy and priorities. And it is a broadly based group, including practitioners and users of scientific innovation. Investment in the programme across the UK is now at £37.5 million. That is the Delivering Assisted Learning Life Skills at Scale programme. It's a Scottish consortium, Living It Up, which won the opportunity of implementing the programme across Scotland. It's establishing work that will reach communities of 55,000 people by the summer of 2015. And it comes from assisted living work being done by Scottish scientists working with the government. So science has a strong role to play in policy making, but it's also got a role to play in allowing us to assess critical evidence and material considerations. Particularly around complex or contentious policy issues, the public often has strong views on what associated science may reveal about benefits, risks, ethical or moral considerations. And those views do need to be heard, respected and fed into the policy process. This is an issue of democracy, trust and good governance. And obtaining those views in an open and meaningful way requires rather more than traditional consultation. It requires a two-way dialogue, where members of the public have an opportunity to interact with scientists, with stakeholders and with policymakers to deliberate on issues likely to be important. Open, of course.
Dr. Richard-Simpson.
Whilst I entirely agree with the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, the incidence of the MMR vaccine was an illustration of a divergence between public opinion based on no evidence and so all the scientific evidence, all the medical colleges, the Chief Medical Officer, etc., all agreeing that the MMR was actually effective and had nothing to do with autism. What is he and his government going to do to make sure that when the public are engaged, there is a method for ensuring that the press and the public are properly informed and engaged in a proper way?
The member makes an important point, and I'm just coming to the issue of Science-Wise, a UK-wide initiative with knowledge and experience of running public dialogues around science and technology-related issues. Because the member raises an important specific issue, which was an issue of press perception, public perception, as set against scientific information and fact and advice. And we can't change that overnight throughout society, but we can do it by a process of education and information. And projects such as Science-Wise, which hopes to educate a whole range of people through dialogue, means that we can touch even the hard-to-reach places like the press, so that people understand science and technology-related issues. Now, we're involved in steering its work through the Civil Service Reform Plan, and the Office of the Chief Scientific Advisor are also focused on making open policy-making and information around policy-making accessible to all. We've also taken a lead role in the EU-funded Places project, a pan-European initiative exploring best practice in the concept of cities of scientific culture. And making sure there is a pro-science, an understanding culture of science, will address the point that Dr. Simpson makes, but it has to be addressed in government too. So all sides of politics have to be devoted to, interested in, and support science-based policy making. Now, science centres and festivals are other ways in which we can influence the public's view, and the government has supported those and has helped to connect citizens with science-related policy process and the issues of science. They provide venues, opportunities and excitement for people of all ages to discover things about science and to understand the importance of science in our lives. And this year we've allocated £3.5 million to support centres, festivals and other initiatives. And in those events, Scottish Government scientists play an important role. I am keen to see, and I'm glad I do see, the role of scientists who work for government, always out there, always engaging with people. I was very glad, for example, that Professor Muffy Calder took on the chairmanship of the IT Excellence Group within my own portfolio, so that she could engage with users of IT and develop the right ideas for the continuation of IT excellence in Scotland. And in classrooms, we have to make sure, talking of education, that science is at the heart of what we do. The work of government scientists to go to schools and to bring real-life relevance to science lessons is theirs too. Their role in supporting extracurricular activities such as STEM clubs, their actions as role models, telling their own stories about the range of careers open to young people in science. And there are thousands of scientists, engineers and technologists across Scotland, working in the public and private sector, who are also undertaking those tasks and working through the excellent STEM Ambassadors programme. SASA staff will organise school visits, as many others. And Marine Scotland organised their first Glow Meet for 1,700 pupils earlier this year. So engaging scientists with policy making, engaging the public with science, making sure that the ideas of science, the enthusiasm for science and the opportunities for science are made known through our schools and through our society. Those are all very, very important things. And so is increasing the opportunities to study science. And I'm very pleased that we've been able year on year to continue to support STEM projects that do so and encourage others to come into science, including the young women who have often been deterred to come into scientific careers, but work that is being done on that is of importance, as indeed is the importance through things like the Young Primary Engineers Awards, which I'll be involved in later this week. Politics and science are not separate. They're intertwined. The idea that politics and policy making somehow stands aside from other things in society is plain wrong. The role of science in encouraging policy making in Scotland is clear, and I'm very glad that Dr. Allen decided to bring this issue to debate, and when he comes and contributes to it, I'm sure his enthusiasm will shine through. And as Mr. Finlay says from a Assembly position, we will all be delighted. I'm sorry I've well, not him, apparently. He's unable to decide which evidence he can support, whether the evidence of my contribution or what is still to come from Dr. Allen. Well, he'll take a scientific view, I'm sure. I'm sorry I'm not able to repay the compliment, because I have to say that his amendment is far from scientific. It shows that curious obsession with the Constitution that the Labour Party now has. Most regrettable, they should take a much broader view of the world. They should try and engage with really important issues, as we are doing in this debate. So it's unable to support it, but we are able to support the Tory amendment because it simply exhorts us to try harder. And I have to say, I do think, Presiding Officer, objections from the Labour side to support Tory amendments are quite extraordinary. The evidence base would show they always support the Tory party, whatever they do in this country, much to our regret. Can I commend this motion, Dr. Allen's motion, to the Chamber? The results that we see from science-based policy making in Scotland are very important indeed and are there to be observed. And can I also welcome Dr. Allen to the Chamber? I am profoundly glad to see him here. I move the motion in Dr. Allen's name.
I thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think we're all very pleased to see Dr. Allen. I now call on Joe Finlay to speak to and move amendment number 5154.2. Mr. Finlay, you've got about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Can I move the amendment in my name before we start. And can I welcome Dr Allen, who has just parachuted in from afar. Thank you, Presiding Officer. The role of science is, of course, vital and influencing all that we do as a society, and a central part in supporting our economy. So, like the Government, I think this is a very important debate, and it's something we should recognise. And in our learning of human development and the creation and application of new technologies, our understanding of the world, and indeed the universe around us, science helps us explain both simple and often extremely complex concepts and practical solutions that are brought to bear on many of the world's most serious problems. From the Big Bang through evolution, weather patterns, invention, space travel and new technology, science is at the core of our understanding of life and our interactions with all aspects of it. In our schools, science is taught from the earliest years, and the new school curriculum lends itself to encouraging a cross-curricular approach to the study of it. And I know our teachers will rise to the occasion, as they always do, to deliver new and stimulating lessons, not just in the traditional sciences of chemistry, biology and physics, but lessons in health and food technology, geography, music, science, art and information technology, and of course all of the other disciplines that go to make up the curriculum. But of course it's through school learning that throughout history Scots have been inspired to become world leaders in the development of new scientific advances, and celebrated Scots scientists and inventors have made a tremendous impact on the world and on humanity. Obvious examples include John Logie Baird, whose impact I think we could all say was truly revolutionary, and I'm sure that even a visionary like him would hardly have conceived the power and breadth of his work. And I'm absolutely certain that at some point during his experimentation there was a sceptical Scottish lab assistant looking over his shoulder saying, "I don't know why you're wasting your time on that thing, it'll never catch on." But others, such as James Young Simpson, changed medical science forever. Paraffin Young was a pioneer in the field of shale oil technology, something that was referred to only a few minutes ago in the chamber. And in recent years, Ian Wilmot and Keith Campbell at Roslin Institute created the world's most famous sheep dolly, who changed the face of science by becoming the first mammal to be successfully cloned. And I'm absolutely certain there's a joke in there about politicians somewhere, but of course I will desist. Indeed, Scotland has produced countless physicists, engineers, botanists, astronomers and mathematicians, and I don't include myself in that list. The Scottish Science Hall of Fame lists the following people in the top 10 greatest scientists. So people like Lord Kelvin, famous for the temperature scale and the development of transatlantic telegraph; James Hutton, a pioneering geologist; Logie Baird, as I mentioned; James Watt for the steam engine; Robert Watson Watt, who developed the use of radar; Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone; Fleming and penicillin; Joseph Black, who discovered carbon dioxide; Maxwell, whose achievements are too many to list, and that is not Stuart, I hasten to add; and John Napier, who invented logarithms, and who I now know who to blame for my third-year misery in maths. And there are, of course, countless others unknown to the wider world, but who on a daily basis do important scientific work, including the work within government, and we, of course, recognise that, and the Cabinet Secretary very ably listed some of that. In the Science Hall of Fame, I think there's probably going to be somebody added very soon, and given last week's speech on the careers debate, I'm sure that great Scottish inventor Stuart Stevenson and his brother will soon be joining the Scottish Science Hall of Fame, but maybe we'll hear more about that in the debate, I'm sure. What is striking about that stellar list of scientists, though, is how there's not a single woman on the list. Indeed, there appears to be real issues with the recruitment and retention of women in science. Historically, yep.
Miss Murray.
I do wonder why you did not include Mary Fairfax Somerville, again, whom Committee Room 2 is named after, as a well-known Scottish female scientist.
I thank the member for that intervention. What have you got to say, Mr Findlay?
I thank Dr Murray, who I believe was a scientist herself, for that. But I was referring to the top 10 of the Scottish Science Hall of Fame, and there is no woman in it. And that is the fact of the situation. And I would refer you to it, Presiding Officer. Earlier this year, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, in their paper Tapping All Our Talents, Women in Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths, suggested that, and I quote, Scotland fails to realise the full potential of its research base and will continue to do so if it systematically fails to cope with the debilitating loss of talent represented by the high attrition rate of highly trained women from employment. Although our universities now graduate large numbers of women in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, 73% of women graduates are lost from STEM, compared with 48% of male graduates, with a corresponding loss of researchers. In academia, expensively trained women are lost in larger proportions than men at every step of the postgraduate ladder and are underrepresented in top positions across the spectrum of business, public service and academia. And as well as being a loss to those individuals who are missing out, it's also a loss to our economy and society and our policy development. It's estimated that a doubling of women's high-level skill contribution to the economy would be worth as much as £170 million per annum to Scotland's national income. This is something we need to harness, not lose. And isn't it puzzling and frustrating that at a time of recession where we still see many of Scotland's science and technology companies complaining that they can't find people with the skills they need, but at the same time we are haemorrhaging women from this sector. And there are, of course, contributory factors to this, to women not pursuing a long career commitment in this sector, most obviously family commitments, but this is only part of the story. The Royal Society point to cultural factors that relate to attitudes in the workplace, the organisation of science and technology and the difficulties in accessing career resources, and with such low levels of female participation, a lack of inspirational role models.
Patrick Harvey.
For giving way. I agree strongly with the points he's making about the need to attract and retain women in STEM subjects. I'm just curious as to why neither the amendment nor the speech is saying much about the role of scientific advice in public policy, which is the title of the debate.
Neil Findlay.
I will come on to that, Mr Harvey. And the fact is that this has got a critical role to play, because if we're only taking a male perspective, or a largely male perspective on policy, then I think our policy process is much the worse off for that. Presiding Officer, the apparent glass ceiling and the draining of female talent has to be tackled as a matter of urgency, and we should seriously consider the views of the Royal Society and their recommendations. And they ask the Scottish Government to take a lead in committing itself to a national strategy, an action plan aimed at retaining and promoting women in STEM. At the UK level, they're looking to extend parental leave to recognise equal responsibilities of mothers and fathers for parenting, and a call on business and industry to address the issue of job design and introduce quality part-time employment at all levels. STEM advisory boards should be developing gender equality strategies, and funders of university and research should link funding to gender equality. And as we're on the subject of science, it would be appropriate to ask what the impact of constitutional change would have on our ability to retain our position as a world-class centre for science. Statistics show that despite Scotland's relatively small size, we manage to constantly punch above our weight in terms of how much research funding we are awarded. As discussed in the amendment to the motion, despite Scotland's population being just over 8% of the UK's total, we still managed to secure nearly 14% of the funding. Yes?
I thank the member for giving way. Will he acknowledge that the benefit, if you like, that Scotland reaps in terms of research funding is due not to any act of charity, but to the excellence of Scottish institutions?
Neil Findlay.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we would recognise that and hope that that would continue. However, these are legitimate questions to be asked. A recent University Scotland briefing paper also found that in 2009-10, Scottish universities competitively won £116 of research income per head of population, and this compares to £68 in England, 52 in Wales and 50 in Northern Ireland. So would a Scotland separated from the rest of the UK manage to maintain this level of funding? I think that is a legitimate question to ask, and all of that is something that we should be asking, because all of that feeds into our policy development process.
Dr. Simpson.
wish to note that the Wellcome Foundation stopped paying for research at 100% in Ireland after it became independent. And the other point I think needs to be made is it isn't just getting research. It isn't just getting the research, it's getting the research in competition. And that competition is critical to the seriousness and the standard of our future.
Mr Finlay.
As always, Dr Simpson adds weight to our debate, and I'm sure I don't need to add any further to that. These doubts were raised by one of the UK's most respected scientists, Professor Hugh Pennington, who argued that the key to the monumental success of British science has been the unimpeded two-way traffic of ideas, money and people across the border. If Scotland was to leave the UK, he views it as inevitable that the Scottish research funding would take a hit, hurting universities and their ability to remain a major player. Fears about research funding in an independent Scotland were also raised by the University and College Union, who claimed they were concerned that independence might lead to a decrease in research funding for Scotland. So, to conclude, Presiding Officer, I would agree that we must support and recognise the achievements of science and how that develops into our public policy agenda, but let's acknowledge that there is much work still to be done, and let's have an honest debate and analysis of how science in Scotland would be affected by future constitutional change.
I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to Move Amendment 5154.1. Mr Fraser, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome this debate on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy. Can I welcome the Minister to his place? I'm sorry the Cabinet Secretary has now departed. I thought he valiantly stood in for the Minister in his absence. I'm not sure what it is about the Cabinet Secretary, but I always find him much more agreeable when he's delivering somebody else's speech rather than his own. And indeed, I find very little to disagree with in the Cabinet Secretary's opening remarks, or for that matter, indeed, in what we've just heard from Mr Finlay. I thought we've heard some excellent contributions made about the role of science. I would just like to preface my remarks by making the point that scientists are not always right. We should always approach scientific advice with a healthy dose of scepticism. Let me give 2 examples of what I'm talking about. If we went back 80 years, we'd find the science of eugenics was a very respectable viewpoint held amongst the scientific community. That is a scientific theory which reached its hideous endpoint at the Nazi concentration camps. You will not find a respectable scientist today, Presiding Officer, who will admit to believing in eugenics. And yet, within living memory, that was a scientific belief that was very widely held throughout society. Similarly, when it comes to an issue like climate change or global warming, we are now told today that there is a scientific consensus about the impact of human behaviour on global warming and global temperatures. You don't have to go back that far, Presiding Officer, to the 1970s, 40 years or so, to find that these self-same climate scientists were telling us we were about to get another ice age. So it's right. Yes, happily, give me. Yes.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm sure the members are aware that, in fact, the basic mechanism of the greenhouse gas has been identified for over 150 years, and that while other environmental suggestions may have been raised, there's been no lack of consistency on that. Surely, when he voted for the Climate Change Act, he was not under any illusion about the level of scientific consensus on climate change.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I don't want to depart into debate about climate science, Mr Harvey. I'm simply making the point very gently, and I seem to have rather hit a raw nerve with Mr Harvey by doing so, that in the 1970s there was a strong scientific consensus that we were heading for another ice age, and I would refer him to the scientific articles which I can produce for him if he wishes, that said that at the time. So I think we should always be wary when a scientific consensus is claimed, and always be challenging and always having debate on these matters. Let me raise a couple of issues where I think, despite what we've heard from the Scottish Government about scientific evidence and advice, we could probably do with a bit more science in terms of the debate. And the first is on the issue of genetically modified crops. Now, it is widely believed throughout the world and throughout the scientific community that there are great opportunities here and the ability to feed the world's growing population with this technology. And if any member here has not had the opportunity to do so, I would strongly recommend they visit the excellent James Hutton Institute in Invergowrie, which is doing some world-leading research in this area, but is held back from the Scottish Government's current approach that does not permit them to do field trials of GM crops. I understand the pressure governments are under. I understand there is concern in the public. I understand there is a lot of pseudoscience out there on the internet, and I understand that there are concerns about tabloid headlines about Frankenstein foods. I would simply say to the Scottish Government that they should have more courage and listen to somebody like Anne Glover, the former scientific advisor to the Scottish Government and the current chief scientific advisor to the EU, who has said just this year, and I quote, "There is no substantiated case of any adverse impact on human health, animal health or environmental health." So that's pretty robust evidence, and I would be confident in saying that there is no more risk in eating GMO food than eating conventionally farmed food. Presiding officer, I'm sure you will recognise that amongst scientists there is a very strong belief that we should not be closing the door on GM crops, and that is something the Scottish Government, I think, should be listening to in terms of the scientific advice. And the other area I would raise is the whole question of energy policy. Now, the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee has just done an extensive inquiry into renewable energy. And what was interesting about the breadth of the evidence we took as a committee was how the weight of the scientific and technical evidence was very sceptical about an over-focus on intermittent forms of energy, particularly onshore wind. And when we looked at the evidence that came forward from bodies such as the Institutes of Engineers, who put a joint submission to the committee, from Sir Donald Miller, the former chair of Scottish Power, from Colin Gibson, the former Network Power Director of National Grid, it all expressed the same concerns. And on the other side of the debate, we had the lobbyists. We had WWF, Friends of the Earth and Scottish Renewables, all saying there was no problem. Well, I think we should be listening to the scientists and the experts and not the lobbyists. And I think we'd get better policy if we did that as a result. But let me turn, if I can, Presiding Officer, to my amendment, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for indicating his support for that, because education is absolutely vital, because no matter how good our scientific advice is today, we need to make sure that we are training the next generation of scientists to come up to continue providing that necessary advice. And we do have skills gaps here, and I think any member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee will be aware from the evidence presented to us regularly that there is a concern, particularly in areas such as engineering and science, that we are not getting sufficient flow of new entrants to the industry coming forward, and that's a point that Neil Findlay picked up in his remarks a moment ago. There is a problem at college level with cuts in STEM courses. According to a parliamentary written answer I got just a few weeks ago, there's been a 41% decline in the number of places in science and mathematics at FE colleges since 2008-2009. And that's not surprising at a time of squeeze on college budgets. I don't want to go into that whole debate today, Presiding Officer. We've discussed it enough over the past few weeks. But when colleges are under financial pressure, it's very easy to make the cuts in courses that are expensive to deliver, that are labour-intensive and require a lot of space. And these are science and technology courses, and courses in things like engineering, whereas it's much cheaper to deliver courses in a lecture theatre where you can pack a lot of students in. So we need to be careful about this and make sure we are making sure that these college courses are available. And we also need better careers guidance. Too often the message came forward, Presiding Officer, that youngsters are not getting the proper advice about the opportunities available in new industries and also in things like oil and gas and renewables. Much more needs to be done in that field. We do need a new generation of scientists, Presiding Officer, and I am pleased to move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. We now move to the open debate, and I call on George Adam to be followed by Ian Gray. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to open up by saying my own father, my dad, was an amateur winder, an engineer himself, repaired electric motors and generators, and he was a proud tradesman, learned from a very practical level, and eventually became self-employed and employed people who came from a more academic, scientific engineering background, and was able to open himself to other markets, be able to compete in the sector that way as well by taking on that advice. He tried to get his son to be an engineer as well. That didn't go quite as well because I found out it was a connection with physics, which was never a strong subject of my own, and I managed to actually burn out one of the electric motors in his coil winding machine during one all-nighter we were doing during an emergency. So obviously he gave me the keys of the van and I became a salesperson for him then. But, Presiding Officer, he might be looking down laughing at my attempt to debate science and engineering advice, but the one thing he did tell me was Scotland's record in scientific innovation, and it's among the best in the world. A report compiled in 2009 confirms that Scotland's research is cited by other researchers around the world more often than any other country in comparison to gross domestic product. And I'm mentioning this because I'm talking with regards to Labour's amendment, which says what would make the difference if there was a constitutional question or independence. For me, Scotland has such a record in science throughout the world that this would probably just continue nonetheless. The report found that Scotland was first in terms of citations relative to gross domestic product, as I said, second in terms of impact of research as measured by the citations, and fourth in terms of impact of the most highly cited papers in the area. New research published by the Institute of Physics in October showed that the contribution of physics-based business to the economy was up £1 billion since 2005 to £8.5 billion. The sector contributes 9.8% gross value added to the economy, compared with the total UK average of 8.5%. Professor Sir Peter Knight says physics drives the economy of Scotland, and Scotland leads the UK. Physics-based business contributes to a greater share of the economy for Scotland than their counterparts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and now is the time to build on this advantage. And I think for me, when you look at this, we say this just goes down to the fact that Scotland does have such a regard in the world with regards to scientific endeavours and engineering. One of the other things that was mentioned by Labour was the potential with women employment with regards to the sciences, and the Science and Engineering Education Advisory Report said in February this year there was a number of things brought up, and following that the Scottish Government had the Career Scotland was launched at the first Women's Employment Summit held in September this year, and the initiative will try and encourage young women to consider careers in science and engineering. There's a 3-year commitment to government funding of Scottish science education research, with ring-fence funding for new work on primary teachers. 3-year funding for Scottish science centres and festivals, as mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary, and continued development of Education Scotland STEM support. While Scotland leads the world in this sector, and we look to continue this, I'd like to take you to the centre of the universe and back to Paisley, where the School of Science and Research at UWS and research within Paisley's University, they're currently researching Environmental Initiatives Research Group, tackling issues in waste and pollution management, climate change and human health. There's also mathematics and statistics research. Our research covers all areas from pure mathematics to applied mathematics. There's molecular and health sciences research group as well, along with sport, health and exercise research group. So that, again, goes to prove that there is so much happening even within one university within Scotland. Talking of Paisley, everyone will talk about famous scientists. Mr Finlay brought up some that were already in Scotland. Mr David Stowe, although not a scientist, created the science of teacher training. He was from Paisley, they went to Paisley Grammar School and began to work with Port Eglinton Spinning Company in 1811. He also wrote the first book in 1828 entitled Teacher Training. So he obviously is still remembered to this day, with obviously Stowe College in Glasgow, Kelvin Road Museum and Stowe Street in Paisley, which incidentally is quite close to my own parliamentary office. John Witherspoon actually was not a scientist, but he was also a preacher who went over to America and signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was the president of Princeton University. And obviously at a time when things were difficult for the American new colonies at that time, he set up one of the greatest places of learning in the world as well. So it just shows you that they didn't have a problem about the idea with independence, and they were always looking outward and seeing what they could do as well. And for me, that would definitely be the same come independence for Scotland itself. Presiding Officer, it's important to be sure we encourage all our young people to take up the science subjects. I've mentioned some of the issues that we've had today, ensuring that they retain the passion for it throughout their career. Paisley, OK, I'll admit it, the whole of Scotland, has given the world so much in this field, so we must ensure we continue this and provide the world with more Scottish scientific and engineering breakthroughs.
Very much. Now call on Ian Gray to be followed by Brian Adam. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scotland certainly should aspire to science-based policy making, given our historical record in science, whether some have been mentioned already, whether it was Hutton working out the age of the Earth for the first time, or C.T.R. Wilson, Scotland's only scientific Nobel Prize winner, developing the cloud chamber, where the fundamental particles that make up the universe are being discovered, or James Clerk Maxwell, who developed the equations which describe the underlying structure of the universe itself. Currently, too, as many members have said, we still punch well above our weight when it comes to science. We're third in the world when it comes to peer-reviewed scientific papers per head of population. And as has been already pointed out, we garner for Scottish research facilities far more than our fair share of UK research funding. And I say to the Minister that, yes, of course, we do that because of the quality of our research, but we also do it because of access to that bigger research funding pot. And I put to a research scientist recently the argument which says, well, scientists all collaborate across borders. You would still be able to do that if we were independent. To which he replied, I can collaborate across any border if I have the funding for my research. These are real concerns in the scientific community, and they should not be dismissed. Now, back last year, the Royal Society of Edinburgh produced a report into this topic and made a very strong point that before we can have proper science-based policy making, we must have a better level of understanding of science, both in the public but also amongst politicians. And it is true that there are three areas in which our politics and our science sometimes clash. One is around causality, and Dr. Simpson talked about MMR, where a connection, which was not a causal connection between vaccination and autism, led to a drop in herd immunity, or the disappearance of herd immunity in Scotland. And we have to be honest and say that this was not just a problem of the media, that there were certain politicians who rode that bandwagon as well and contributed to that problem, which still has consequences today. There is also the whole issue of certainty, a lack of understanding that in science, uncertainty is actually fundamentally built in to the universe, and so the question, are you 100% sure, can never be answered yes, and too often we ask that question to which there cannot be the answer we're looking for. But perhaps the biggest clash we've already seen today in the Chamber, and that's around the way the scientific consensus operates, where we had Murdo Fraser hinting perhaps that he didn't want to accept the scientific consensus around climate change, and then attacked by Patrick Harvey, as we might expect, who of course refuses to accept the scientific consensus around GM crops, or indeed nuclear power and its safety and the contribution it should make to our energy strategy.
Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. He mentions GM, and rightly there are times when my party is willing to be faced with questions if we assert something that's not scientifically valid. Does he accept that many of us have first and foremost an economic objection to GM, which is a technology that can only transfer ownership of agriculture into the hands of multinationals?
I accept that economic arguments are made, but the fact of the matter is that when it comes to climate change, when those you would call climate change deniers find scientists, outriders outside the consensus, they bring their arguments to the fore, and I would argue that some of Mr Harvey's colleagues do exactly the same thing when it comes to GM crops. Look, in an article not that long ago in Holyrood magazine, the Science Minister said that, in his view, Scotland was a science nation. And I think that is an aspiration that we should absolutely pursue. But if we are serious about that, we need to bring science into the strategic level of policy making. Many members have talked about the chief scientific advisers that we've had, two particularly good role models, in fact, for women, and Glover and Muffy Calder, and the scientific advisers in other departments as well. But it remains the case that we don't have scientific advisers in Scotland in all departments, as they do in Whitehall. And it is also the case, I think, that they do not have a strong direct line to the highest levels of government. The Cabinet Secretary said that he and the Science Minister regularly meet Muffy Calder. I'm sure that is wonderful for her. I would like to hear that she met regularly with the First Minister and talked to him about what science is telling us about our policy. There was mention too of the Advisory Committee, a committee which I set up and chaired the first meeting when I was the Enterprise Minister, and it was correctly stated that that gave independent advice. I wonder if that independence is less valuable than connecting it to the centre of government. I would like that Science Advisory Committee to be more like FISAB or the Energy Advisory Board, chaired by a Cabinet Minister for Science, or even, as these other boards are, the First Minister on occasion, to demonstrate exactly how important science is to policy and policy making in this nation. And it is worth saying that we will never be a science nation if we lose 73% of our women graduates. More than that, and this is my last suggestion, and I will wind up, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Grateful.
The First Minister is well known, of course, for collecting Nobel laureates, but they are usually Nobel laureates of the dismal science. My suggestion is that, as well as a Council of Economic Advisers, he considers a Council of Scientific Advisers, so that Nobel laureates from wider fields could enjoy dinner with the First Minister, but more importantly, influence the policy of this Scotland, a science nation.
Many thanks. Now call on Brian Adam to be followed by Elaine Murray. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by talking about evidence. Certainly, decisions should be evidence-based, but often we quote, as politicians, opinions as evidence, and there is a world of difference between evidence that is tangible as opposed to someone's opinion. And I'm delighted that successive governments have taken advice from the scientific, medical and engineering communities, but it is only advice. At the end of the day, policy decisions are made by politicians. In fact, it's wonderful to use hindsight to see whether or not the decisions made were the correct ones. And if we look at the addiction to nicotine, we can see that all of those statements that were given to us by the medical community were borne out in terms of the fact. But it took some brave policy decisions by the government of the day and brave decisions by the Parliament based on that to reach the conclusion. Now, while we talk about renewables and we have accusations of all sorts of flying back and forth. People are accused of being climate change deniers. It will be interesting to see whether people's opinions are brought out and whether policy is more like with hindsight. Indeed, in the last few days, we've had research done by scientists that links vitamin D with MS and suggestions that the further north you go, you are more likely to contract the disease. But whether it's firmly evidence-based will only be brought out with time. And it's very easy to take that research at face value or otherwise. And it's interesting how those who choose to use scientific research to support their policy decisions, whether it's valid or otherwise. We've had Patrick being accused of being a climate change denier because he supports the abolition of nuclear and favour of renewable. I have to say with you, but we will only know whether it's true or not with time. I think that there are a number of members with links to the scientific medical and with due respect, the engineering community in the Parliament. And I'm delighted that that is also true of government. But we can't be accused of taking silly advice in that our scientific advisor, Professor Anne Glover, to talk about gender politics, has been cherry-picked by Europe. And I'm delighted that she has, but it shows we're on the right lines. I'm grateful for your forbearance, but others may have watched the addiction programs something been shown in the BBC. Now, some of the science, unlike eugenics, not tiny fever, but a lot of science around the link between cancer and the consumption of tobacco smoke was done in Germany pre-war. And, those with an interest choose to ignore it because of the source. The fact is, it's been borne out, and indeed other research conducted showing the link between nicotine and cancer has been borne out. By hindsight, I think that the government is right to take scientific, medical and engineering advice, but it shouldn't rely on it, and it should be willing to use the evidence of hindsight to see whether evidence is valid or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Dr. Elaine Murray to be followed by Nigel Dawn. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government clearly has an able team of scientific advisers, and the 4 individuals to whom the Cabinet Secretary referred in his speech, and indeed 3 of those, Professors Calder, Morris and Heathwaite, are all relatively new additions, having been appointed this year. And it's maybe a good time to give our congratulations to Professor Anne Glover, who went on from becoming our Chief Scientific Advisor to becoming the Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Union, where I'm sure she continues to play an important role. Ian referred to the previous arrangements with the Scottish Science Advisory Committee, where the Chief Advisor was actually appointed by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and that committee does continue to sit. However, a paper produced by the Royal Society of Edinburgh last September, or the September before last, I should say, notes that the level of access of the Scottish Scientific Advisory Council to ministers and the opportunity to influence policy is not as strong in Scotland as it is in Whitehall, where there is a more comprehensive system of chief scientific advisers across all departments. And I would therefore ask whether the Government does actually intend to increase its scientific adviser service across all of its departments. The crucial issue, of course, will be whether the Scottish Government will take its advisers' advice if that advice runs contrary to their current policy. Indeed, the RSE paper to which I referred earlier is also the point which Richard Simpson made in his intervention on the Cabinet Secretary, recognises that there is tensions which exist between scientific knowledge and public values, and that there will be occasions when, due to societal pressures, and often these societal pressures, as we've already mentioned, are fuelled by the media, elected governments will choose not to accept the advice of their chief scientific advisers. And in that context, I would like to draw the Parliament's attention to something Professor John Kay, Professor of the Dark Arts, as my colleague Ian Gray would say, said to the Finance Committee when he gave evidence on the draft budget on the 24th of October this year. Professor Kay said, "I have spent my life believing in and advocating evidence-based policy. I've actually seen more and more of what I call policy-based evidence, where people think up a policy and tell people to go away and find the evidence to support it. Discussion on evidence-based policy has unfortunately led to more and more of that. Largely spurious calculations are generated to support the alleged benefits of policies. A lot of the work that is currently being done on providing impact assessments and so on would be better not done because they are superficial exercises that fall into the policy-based evidence category. We have persuaded ourselves that this is a process of rational decision-making, when in reality it is the obvious." Now, Professor Kay was not talking specifically about the Scottish Government. He was making a more general criticism of policy makers. But his comments apply here as much as they do in other legislatures. And I believe that this Parliament and the Scottish Government do need to pay heed to his criticism. Because science will not necessarily tell politicians what they want to hear. Science most often makes progress when theories are proved wrong, and when the received wisdom is unable to explain newly observed phenomena. And unfortunately, we as politicians know, on the other hand, that we are often very loath to admit that we have been wrong. In science, there is no value in only seeking out evidence which suggests that you are right. You must also seek out the evidence which could prove that your theories are incorrect. It is the evidence that matters and not the assertion. And therefore, the Scottish Government, or any government, if they wish to develop policy using evidence provided by the scientific community, you will have to accept that the evidence and the advice of CSAs could run contrary to current policy. It could actually suggest that your policies are not working. Now, if I go on to the issue of women in science, the presiding officer was very keen that I should mention Mary Fairfax Somerville, a famous female scientist from Jedburgh, who was a mathematician, an astronomer and a science writer. Committee Room 2 is named after her, and it was, in fact, the presiding officer and myself who were keen to press that she would be remembered in this way. And I'm also pleased to note how many eminent female scientists are and have been appointed to the Chief Scientific Advisors positions, because prominent female role models are very important in encouraging young women to consider STEM subjects as a career. And on that, I should mention that the first ever president of the Royal Society of Chemistry as a woman is Professor Leslie Yellowlees of Edinburgh University, and she actually was in the year above me at university, although, indeed.
Alec Johnson.
Would the member acknowledge that the only Prime Minister this country has ever had who held a science degree was a woman as well, and she is a role model that we should all be proud of?
I do indeed. Indeed, Mrs Thatcher and I were actually in the same line of scientific research at one point, not at the same time. But I used to get a lot of ragging from some of my colleagues, you can imagine. But our amendment refers to the loss of women trained in science, technology, engineering and maths. This is not just about getting women into it, it's also about the fact that the women who have started off, like myself, one of those 73%, actually drop out later on. And this was the subject of an excellent report published by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and produced by a working group which is chaired by the distinguished astrophysicist Professor Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and I was indeed very honoured to chair a meeting of the cross-party group on science and technology, where she gave an extremely inspiring and thought-provoking presentation on the findings of that working group. And she is a woman who is of a great inspiration, I think, to aspiring women scientists. Can I also, just in closing, refer to our amendment and the point made by Professor Hugh Pennington. I find it difficult that the SNP members are unable to appreciate. It is because we are so good in Scotland that we achieve so much more of funding than our population base. If it was based on our population base, we would have had something like 370 million less in research in Scotland. It is because we are good. And that's actually the whole point for a lot of us. We are quite confident in the Union because we know that Scotland's good. We actually know that we can hold our heads up high and that we can achieve and that we can bang the drum for Scotland. And we do that in science as we do in so many other areas.
Many thanks. I now call on Nigel Donn to be followed by Liam MacArthur. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Before I get into what I thought I was going to say, I do want to pick up on a couple of points that have already been made. Can I take Dr. Elaine Murray's point about the need to change our mind? Every scientist knows that's what you do. But it seems to be the most heinous offence for a politician, especially in the minds of the media. So I think we do need to maybe persuade the media of that point, as well as perhaps a few others. I also take Murdo Fraser's amendment and the point about teachers. And Ian Gray and I were at a meeting relatively recently with physics teachers at all levels. And one of the points that I made there, and I will repeat, is that I recall my physics teachers, and they were successful, they got me an A-level in the subject, as being slightly mad. Now, I don't want to overstate that adjective, but I do take the point, or would like to make the point, that teachers actually have to be an inspiration. It doesn't matter how dismal your science is, you've still got to have some sort of role model and somebody whose appreciation of the subject actually inspires you. And maybe that's an important point that we sometimes forget when we kind of turn out teachers. The good ones are perhaps born, not made. If I can then just address some of the issues of science, I want to go back to some understanding perhaps of how we do science. Can I point out that some of the things that we do are based in really old science, and absolutely basic science. And you'll see in a minute or two why I'm getting where I'm going with this. But thermodynamics and the laws of physics and gravity have been around for, as it were, centuries, but they actually inform some pretty basic things. And when I get on, as members might not be surprised, in benefit of hindsight, onto the subject of obesity, you'll see where at least the laws of thermodynamics come into this. But let's start by just reflecting on the James Hutton Institute down the road from me in Brechin, except of course it's in Dundee, and also a little bit further north. Mike Russell made mention of this. They've done a huge amount of work on the genomes of potato and barley in particular. That's some analytical science so that they can breed into better products. GM is actually only a way of speeding up that breeding process, and I think we do need to understand some of the science behind that on occasions. Equally, they've done some modelling. So they will be able to look at various options that might come out of the European Union on single farm payments and actually give a pretty clear view of how that would affect the economy of our rural communities. Given that we're talking about something like 650 million euros, that's actually quite important work. So there we've got some modelling. Now, if we move on briefly to the subject of obesity, there is this very basic science that tells us that we are what we eat. There's a mass balance. What goes in and doesn't come out is going to have to stay. And equally, there's an energy balance. The energy we take in and doesn't come out one way or another is going to have to stay and be stored somewhere. Those laws are totally non-negotiable, whether we like it or not. The various other things we can do in experiments in this kind of area, we can observe populations. There's a Scottish Health Survey done on an annual basis, picks up all sorts of personal measurements. Some lifestyle indicators enable us to get some clues as to what's going on. I have to report that the news is not altogether good. we are still seriously overweight. That is, 2/3 of us are seriously overweight. The lifestyle indicators are not getting very much better either. Some very recent work has indicated actually that we can determine whether a child is likely to become an obese child and a grown-up adult obese by looking at things about the parents' BMI, birth weight of the child, maternal gestation, weight gain, behaviour and social indicators are all in there, and they give us a pretty good model of whether or not a child is likely to be at risk. Perhaps disturbingly, the genetic score makes precious little difference to the accuracy of the prediction. So actually, our chances are probably already defined at birth, not by our genetics, but by who we're born to. There are various other experiments that can be done. We can actually give people different things to eat and see how much they eat. There's some satiety work being done at the Rat, which tends to suggest that if you eat a protein-based meal, the same number of calories are likely to fill you up better. Sadly, fat does entirely the reverse. It gives you more calories and actually has less satiety, which tells us what we already know, which is that fat-laden materials are not good ones to eat. But we know a lot. We actually know a huge amount. We are currently doing an experiment. I don't know whether people realise this. This is my point. As a nation, and it's not just Scotland, it's most of Western Europe, we are doing the experiment of having evidence-based, scientific evidence-based health messages out there, substantially drowned out by the advertising of those kind of products which are fast foods and fizzy drinks and choc bars and the like. We actually know what the result is going to be. And actually, if we want to make sure that we have a healthy society, or a healthier society than we've got, government actually has to preempt the result of that experiment. We know those health messages are not going to be enough. We actually have to take charge of the environment in which we're living in ways in which at the moment governments throughout the world are not prepared to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Liam MacArthur to be followed by Fiona MacLeod. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming Dr Allen to his seat and express some sympathy for him as somebody whose plane very often goes technical. I find that there's very often very little scientific, engineering or technological evidence or explanation to passengers in those circumstances. But I welcome today's debate. I think at first glance it may strike some as esoteric, but I think as every member that has spoken in the debate so far has illustrated, it is absolutely fundamental. The way in which science informs public policy, it has been brought home to me over the last 4 or 5 years. If I look at the legislation that I've been involved in scrutinising, whether it be the Climate Change Act, Flood Prevention Act, the Marine Act, there are any number of examples of where the scientific evidence that committees in the Parliament receives has been absolutely critical. Beyond legislation, policy areas too, whether it be energy production efficiency, digital technology, disease management, food production, the areas where scientific evidence has a heavy bearing or should have a heavy bearing on the decisions that we as a Parliament and ministers in government take is brought home to us on a routine basis. And therefore the policy that we take in terms of helping science deliver, I think, is absolutely critical. The government motion, I think, is very worthy. It may be somewhat lacking, and I think the Cabinet Secretary perhaps conceded that fact in that the amendment from Murdo-Fraser instills a degree of urgency, exhorts the government to do more. But I think Neil Finlay's amendment in identifying the challenges that exist, particularly in terms of the lack of women in STEM, but also the potential threats, and I don't think that this can be dismissed from the potential break-up of the UK, can't be glossed over and need to be taken seriously. But the thrust of the government argument, the thrust of the government motion is correct. It points to the scientific advice and policy making being essential to arriving at better decisions, though I think Elaine Murray made an excellent point in pointing to the tendency towards policy-driven evidence as opposed to evidence-based policy making. The government also is right in that not only do we have a fine heritage in this area, as a number of members have alluded to, but that Scotland has world-class scientists doing world-class things right now, and we should be using them. The contribution science can make to meeting a wide range of policy objectives has been set out, including the creation of a high-skilled, high-value economy, and also the importance of public engagement, again for a wide range of reasons, but I was very struck by Richard Simpson's allusion to the MMR instance and the dangers that open up where there are gaps between public attitudes and indeed the way they're picked up in the political arena and scientific evidence. But politicians and ministers take decisions based on a wide variety of factors. As the RSE make clear in their briefing, the role of the wider science community is not to determine policy. That is for government. Their role is to develop and present the evidence for different policy options. They go on to say, science is concerned to understand the working of nature. It is for society to determine how that understanding should be used. And I think Ian Gray was absolutely right to warn of the risks that we seek, absolutes we seek, 100% guarantees from the scientific community, whatever the issue is that we're wrestling with. Science is very often not an absolute. It can be provisional. It's almost always necessarily qualified, as Nigel Dawn and Elaine Murray have pointed to. But that understanding of the scientific evidence, I think, is still vital to good policy making and to good government. How ministers access it, therefore, is a critical question. The Cabinet Secretary pointed to a number of examples of where that expertise and advice is within government, whether it be SEPA, SNH, Marine Scotland, Scottish Water Enterprise Agency or others. But it still remains the case that there is more outside government than there is inside government in terms of expertise. I give way.
Brian Adam. Microphone for Mr Adam, please.
And a healthy relationship between politicians and scientists.
Liam MacArthur.
I thank Brian Adam for that intervention. I certainly wouldn't dispute that fact. There is a healthy and ongoing, and I think a developing relationship between the scientific community and politicians. I think the shorter lines of communication in Scotland undoubtedly help in that respect. I think the Advisory Council is a valuable mechanism, though I think, again, Elaine Murray and Ian Gray both made telling points about the way in which we could perhaps hardwire that more into the way in which decisions are arrived at. The appointment of the Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Anne Glover, I think was a major step forward. Not only is she an Orkneyophile, I think she was very much the kind of role model that we needed to see. In an excellent interview provided courtesy of the Royal Society of Biology, I think Professor Glover sets out her challenges in her new role as the EU advisor. But her appointment, I think, was a step forward in 2006. She had a direct line through the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and I think it is a concern that from 2007 she appeared to then report into the Education Secretary, and her successor, Professor Murphy Calder, appears to report directly to Dr Allen, albeit with access to the Education Secretary. I think there is a point there as to whether or not this is getting the advice from the Chief Scientific Advisor into the very top echelons of government. I welcome the fact that Professor Glover and Professor Calder have been able to provide not only that scientific advice but also that role model. It sends a strong signal in areas where we need to do much better. Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell made an impressive presentation at the CPG last year. The production of the Tapping All Our Talents, I think, has given us a great deal of food for thought. Not only does it remind us of the importance of science, engineering, technology to policy making, our economy and intellectual vitality, it illustrates the cost and the debilitating loss of talent from the high attrition rate of highly trained women from employment in STEM. The loss to individuals is significant, but the loss to the economy and society is greater still. And there is no lack of demand in science and technology sector for these highly qualified individuals. The causes for this are many and varied. The recommendations set out in the report appear realistic and achievable, and I would like maybe confirmation from the Minister in his winding up speech as to whether or not the Cabinet Secretary, or along with himself, will provide the drive to deliver many of these recommendations and give government ownership so that we can see a step change in terms of addressing a problem I think we all agree exists. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Fiona MacLeod to be followed by Helen Eady. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. After following so many of my fellow members who used to be scientists, many of you must be thinking, what's a history graduate and a proud librarian wanting to contribute to this debate? But of course, librarians in my generation are also called information scientists. And the big thing that we do is where the scientists and the researchers go out and find the evidence, we make sure that everybody can access the evidence so that we can have evidence-based public policy. And that's the area that I would like to contain my remarks to, is about how we access and how we use evidence, not necessarily just scientific evidence in public policy, and I hope that's acceptable to the Chamber. I think it's probably interesting if those non-scientists of us, actually have, what does the evidence base mean? And I think it's quite interesting to look at EBSCO's website. EBSCO's a major scientific literature publisher in Europe. And they talk about the evidence base is when conclusions can be based on the best available evidence, but only if that evidence is consistently and systematically identified, evaluated and selected, the role of the librarian. But also, when thinking of that and listening to Murdo Fraser's comments about eugenics in the early part of the 20th century, I think that's where you have to, when you understand the systematic evaluation and selection of evidence, understand that eugenics may have had its day as a fad, but it was never consensus science at any time in the scientific community. And I think that's something that we all have to learn and understand about. But why is it so important that we have evidence-based public policy? And I came across some fantastic quotes from Paul Nurse, who is a Nobel Prize winner in medicine. And Professor Nurse made these comments in New Scientist in 2011. Sorry, you will expect me to reference almost every quote I give. I'm in librarian mode, and we have to have the evidence. But Paul Nurse was talking about the run-up to the presidential election in America last year and the use of science, in quotes, by many of the candidates to justify some of the more ludicrous positions that they were taking. And one of the things that Professor Nurse said, and I think it's important that we keep in mind when we talk about using evidence to produce policy for public politicians, he talked about the fact that the scientific process is such a reliable generator of knowledge, with its respect for evidence, for scepticism, for consistency of approach, and for the constant testing of ideas. And is that not what we as politicians should always be doing? And when I was doing my reading for this debate, I was struck by the fact that when I was on the Health Committee last year and we were looking at the minimum unit pricing debate, you could actually take that in the round to say that that is an excellent example of the evidence base driving public policy. Originally, SNP government politicians looked at evidence in other areas of public health and saw that price actually affected consumption and use of products. So having had that theory, they then set out to look and see if there was evidence to back up that theory. They went to Sheffield University, who did modelling, a theoretical model. But we were very fortunate that at the same time, Professor Stockwell in Canada was actually finding empirical evidence based on over 20 years' worth of statistics to show that the Sheffield model and the theory that the Scottish Government had would work and did work. And therefore, we had scientifically evidence-based policy for minimum unit pricing. And I found it amazing on the Health Committee that Labour refused to accept that evidence. And again today, they're refusing to accept the evidence in front of their face. They're telling us that, caught up in this constitutional hang-up that they have, in this fear of an independent Scotland, that in an independent Scotland we wouldn't get good science. The evidence is not there to back that up. In fact, the evidence is there to the contrary. I'll give way briefly, but I'm about to list you 3 levels of evidence with the references.
Ian Gray.
I really don't think anybody in the debate has said that in an independent Scotland we wouldn't have good science. We've said we would have restricted access to research funds and therefore science would not be funded to the degree that it is today.
Fiona MacLeod.
Thank you very much, Mr Gray. And if I can refer you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh's publication, which many of you have referred to today, to paragraph 12, to say, and exactly the evidence that we need against the assertion you're making. The funding that we have put in place in Scotland, but not just the money, in the creative way that we have got the Funding Council and the universities working together to prioritise research in our universities, and to quote from the RSC, critically proved to be a powerful attractor for the international academic talent into Scotland, a model worthy of notice. We're attracting because we are good. We're attracting the investment, we're attracting the scientists because we're good. And the biggest thing to say as well is the scientific academic community is a global community. So why can't the Labour Party get out of their narrow UK straitjacket? I had much more evidence, but I see that the presiding officer is asking me to wind up. So if I can finish with a last quote, again from Professor Anne Glover, who we have heard from today, from the Biologist, volume 59, number 5, page 33, talking about politicians not interfering with the evidence. And Professor Glover says she has to ask that politicians must be transparent about why they have not used the evidence available, and that's the question we have to ask the Labour Party today.
Many thanks. That's enough. Thank you. We now move to Helen Eadie, to be followed by Marco Biaggi. 6 minutes, please, including interventions from now on.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And if I can just pick up on that last point, first of all, and I think it may be because some people choose to deliberately misinterpret what some of my colleagues in the Labour benches are saying, and that is the fact that what Ian Gray is talking about is access to the structural funds of Europe, which, if you are excluded from membership of Europe, and I'm not one of the people who is saying that we would be advocating that, I believe that Scotland would still continue to be part of the European Union, but it would have to negotiate terms, it would have to negotiate conditions, and what would happen in the interim period when in fact these discussions were ongoing. And I think it's absolutely imperative that that discussion does take place, because it is creating uncertainty right across Scotland, and it's something that you can close your ears to it, but what you can't close is your minds to the facts as they are. Facts are chiels, that Winnie-Ding has often been said in this chamber. But can I say that one of the things I was really pleased to hear about this afternoon was I was in the company of so many other people who had voted for Mary Fairfax Somerville. She had her childhood home in Burntisland, which some of you will know the geography of Dalgety Bay is right next to Burntisland. And that she was a woman who, her story sat in my bookshelves in a book called Women Who Win. And in that book, one of the facts are that her father had considered her a savage and sent her for a year of tuition at Musselburgh, an expensive boarding school. So it's just one of these things that we are very proud of, the fact that we do have a room in the Parliament called the Somerville Room, and I was very pleased to be part of that. But perhaps there's no substitute for any member of the Parliament in this chamber to have had their minds focused so very directly as I have had on the link between scientists from SEPA and Dalgety Bay, where we've had the radiation in Dalgety Bay. That's something which has been an ongoing problem since 1991. Some of the early scientists were hugely dismissive of it. In the very middle years of all the digging and experimentation that was developing there, we had a modest 50 or so fragments discovered. But now in the past year we've had something like 600 fragments of radiation discovered in Dalgety Bay. And what part does the policy advice play in that? Well, we have an organisation called Camari, which, if people will bear with me, I believe is called the Committee for Radiation and Advice in Medical and Environmental Radiation. And that particular organisation has played quite a powerful part in helping to advise and guide us through the risk that there is to health. And I think that one of the concerns that we all have, and it's been mentioned already by Mike Russell when he opened the debate, and that was about the trust and the link to democracy in all of this. And it's something that, there are issues that arise from public agencies, especially if you take in regard matters to do with freedom of information. Freedom of information, as we all know, is something that's not elective, it's not a choice. We have to comply with the legislation on that. But in terms of the science and what happens in science, one of the things that has angered my community recently very, very much has been the fact that Comari released a report prior to it being peer-reviewed and also having had the input of the medical scientists of the Health Board in Fife. Now, that shows you that science is never straightforward, the links between scientists is never straightforward, but it does show that we have a job as well as politicians to make sure that we get the collaboration between scientists right and that there is an issue there. And the issue is, as well, is should that kind of information be released to the public prior to the peer review and prior to it being finalised? Because when reports are not finalised, as we all know, when it's incomplete, the evidence is not complete, that does raise and has raised extreme feelings of anxiety and concern, and the mental well-being, the mental well-being health of my community has been put at risk here. And I have written to the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Alex Neil, asking for an urgent meeting with him to come and allay the health concerns of the public in that regard, to make sure that the policy that he arrives at is a well-founded policy, that is an informed policy, and have the public got any rights to be as frightened as they are at this moment in time. And so that just shows you that where there is a science there and where there's professional expertise, that there are issues. And so having highlighted that particular point about Dalgety Bay, I just say one of the connections that we're especially proud of in the Cowdenbeath constituency, of course, is the link between Sir Professor James Black, CH, who was born in 1924, and he was educated at Beath High School in Cowdenbeath. And he went on to study at St Andrews University. I met my husband at St Andrews University, so I was very proud of that. And he discouraged the chemical potential of the receptor blocking drugs. He pioneered the beta receptor blocking drug propranolol, which helped to fight coronary heart disease and hypertension.
15 seconds remaining.
In 1988, Professor Sir James Black was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiotherapy for unmedicine. So we're very Cowdenbeath constituency is rightfully proud of that connection with Professor James Black. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now calling Marco Biaggi to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. 6 minutes, including interventions, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to speak up on behalf of an element of sciences that's already taken a bit of kicking today, and that is the social sciences. Because any time science is discussed, social science has a hard time getting to the table. It's not always considered sufficiently scientific, but it is, and frankly the clue is in the name. I think we have to recognise, when we're looking at the important role that science can have, that rigorous social scientific evidence very often blurs the line with the STEM family, not least the M part of that. One of the problems, I think, with social science, in terms of the esteem it has in these sorts of debates, is that as it's taught in universities, it leans very heavily towards the qualitative. One acquaintance of mine has 3 degrees in politics and has never once taken a statistical research methods course. And while qualitative research is worthwhile, it is different. Qualitatively, you can look at the same evidence and interpret it differently. That makes it very distinct from the formal scientific method and Karl Popper's principle of falsifiability. But quantitative social science is different and deserves to be credited as such. This and previous Scottish governments have, for example, funded the regular Scottish Social Attitude Survey conducted by ScotSen, based in my constituency. I would point out that the difference between that and the Scottish Health Survey that Nigel Dawn has already pointed to is very marginal. The survey has, over the years, given us plenty of political footballs on constitutional issues, but it's also given irreplaceable hard data on issues like drug use, antisocial behaviour, discrimination and racism. And while very often what we get presented with are the top-line percentages, the detailed statistical analysis that happens with that data gives a much greater insight into the relationships, the contributing factors, and a little bit of what we're doing that works and what doesn't. Frankly, the distinction between that and, for example, epidemiology in health science, which is indisputably STEM, is non-existent. And without doubt, the most obvious social science that we depend on here is economics. Today, jobs and the economy are the top political concern, and I can incidentally verify that because of social science research on mass public opinion. But in this Parliament and public debate, we regularly have to weigh up the pros and cons of all the different economic strategies out there. And it's possible to have fundamentally... yes, go ahead.
Ian Gray.
To hear Karl Popper's name mentioned, but perhaps a member would admit that Popper would probably say economics still hasn't found its paradigm, and therefore it isn't really a science.
Indeed. I think it's the point about economics is, as with all social sciences, it's possible to have different priorities that you take. I can value, for example, greater equality, and another can value other principles. But where you can have different values, it is possible to test to an extent, using the scientific method, whether the policies you're putting forward will realise those values. And in this chamber, with the exception of the Green Party, we are all quite fixated on the objective of economic growth, and we very often scrutinise our economic policies on that basis, which can be subjected to the scientific method, and frankly should. And yes, it's the case that economics is divided quite starkly. I suppose you could characterise it as Keynesianism versus Friedmanism, but in a way, so is physics, between the Newtonian understanding of the universe and Einstein's understanding of the universe, and anybody who can reconcile those two is going to win a Nobel Prize. Here in the Parliament, we also have the very strong consensus on the wisdom of capital investment, and it's very rarely an economic decision that's taken without mention of the GDP multiplier effect, all of which are derived from evidence-based methods that deploy scientific approaches in much the same way as STEM areas. And frankly, I think we should demand the same standard of evidence and the same standard of scrutiny in justifying how we run the economy as we would when deciding whether or not to approve a new hay fever remedy. The UK Cabinet Office issued a paper in June this year that floated the idea of taking actually some of the experience of randomised control trials from drugs and applying them to public policy. And this is what governments already do through piloting, but the rigour of RCTs is much higher. I once remarked to a medical researcher that an error of 3% was reasonable. He replied that that was fine in politics, but if he did it in his discipline, that would mean he'd killed 30 people. I think the area and the lessons that we can take from the sciences, the hard sciences, the so-called hard sciences, into the social sciences is something we should look at very closely. And one last area is one that has been looked at, which is the importance of looking at the evidence and drawing your conclusions that way rather than the other way round. There's one popular book out there that I have some sympathy with that's quite social scientific, but whose evidence base consists of a series of simple bivariate analyses. It's extremely small n case studies and has incredibly weak R-squared values, but it has become the political flavour of the month, in no small part because it has at least nodded towards quantitative terms, however flawed those may be. So I just want to place a marker that there is a lot happening in the social sciences that can inform our discussions here, as long as we respect their strengths and see their limits. Because rigorous scientific research doesn't just help in the fight against disease, but it can help in the fight against racism, and all such research is worthy of recognition today.
Thank you. I now call on Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me declare that I'm an associate member of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. Let me also put on record my thanks to my dentist who managed just before the debate to replace a filling. So science is a practical application as well. So now, suitably equipped, let me get my teeth into this debate. Science Technology, engineering, mathematics, the STEM subjects are what underpins our economy, and in each of these, Scotland has a proud record, variously. For science, the discovery and development of penicillin, Alexander Fleming; technology, the digital analogue signal processing chip that allowed Apple's iPod to be developed; Wolfson Electronics, one of our university spin-outs; engineering, the fax machine, the first electricity-generating wind turbine in Marykirk in 1887; and, already referred to, John Napier in mathematics, the inventor of the slide rule, as well as of the logarithms, a device that's still in use today in circular form on my watch. And Napier might actually be thought to be a model for offering advice to government. In his dedication to plane discovery to James VI in 1594, when Scotland was independent, he was a scientist working in independent Scotland very successfully, Napier counselled the king to reform the universal enormities of his country and first to begin at his own house, family and court. As a very respected mathematician, it's not clear whether his calls were heeded. So what we are doing today to create the ability to learn, innovate, deliver, and crucially for this debate, inform government in future. Because without a well-informed government, excellent outcomes become a matter of mere chance. Perhaps too often in the consultations that we as politicians conduct, we are looking for public opinion rather than searching for facts to inform. Because perhaps the collision of a convenient policy with an inconvenient fact is not something that too many ministers of any politics wish to contemplate very often. In my time as a minister, it was a climate change legislation that was fundamentally driven mostly by scientific fact. In relation to our 2020 target on reduction in greenhouse gases, scientific advice gave us two choices, because good scientific advice informs and guides, it does not command. And they offered a 34% reduction or a 42% reduction. We did debate a 40% reduction, which came from another source in the debate that we had, but that appeared to be politically based. I'm glad we chose a scientifically derived number, because that means we can hold fast to science underpinning that area of policy. So I'm proud that we did choose that kind of paper. We have good examples of our debates being informed by science. Fiona MacLeod referred to the alcohol debate. James VI again, 400 years ago, talked about attending post-mortem examinations of smokers and seeing the evil tar in their lungs. So the monarchs and the rulers in the past have actually looked to science to help to inform, to help to guide. There is a ladder of knowledge that we've got to try and promote to people around. One of the books on my shelf in my office here is about the psychology of mathematics, because mathematics is something people find difficult, and yet they're using it a lot. Anybody who gambles is thinking about the odds, is thinking about numbers. Anybody who fills in their tax form is dealing with numbers. And indeed, the mathematics teacher I had at school, wonderful Lancastrian called Doc Ingalls, used to do his tax form in the 6th year class. That was either to tell us how little he got paid for putting up with us, or to show us there was a practical application to maths. And in the first year, he took us round the school searching for infinity. Now, wasn't that the kind of inspiring teaching that we want to actually have? My time as Environment Minister touched with science on a number of occasions. One of the best ones, which was an engineering and science experiment in the northwest of Scotland, was where all the fish coming down a river were tagged. They were caught and tagged. As they went up and down thereafter, they were recorded as they went up and down. The seals in the bay were tagged. And what actually happened when one of the seals ate one of the fish, the device on the seal recorded the tag on the fish it had just eaten, and in real time, in the little hut on the side of the loch, you had all this information telling you what each individual fish and each individual seal was doing. I was enthused, and it certainly helped me understand the way in which the science that I was using as a minister was really delivering something for us. Scientists, of course, are not always good communicators. My professor of natural philosophy when I was at university was R.V. Jones, great scientist, absolutely crap lecturer. Professor Higgs, I was told only this week. Is that allowed, presiding officer? Well,
no,
a less than perfect lecturer. Professor Higgs apparently is tarred with the same brush by some. But at university, I returned to mathematics because my first-year lecturer, Mr. Morrison, not even a PhD, was so inspiring I got 97% in that term exam. He never lectured me again. I never returned to these dizzy heights. We've talked about error. It's worth saying every error is preceded by generations of failure. Let me just end, presiding officer, by saying we have to change. To conform is to sustain the status quo. To rebel is to create the new. Let's listen to the scientists and find out useful ways of rebelling. Presiding officer.
Thank you. Now call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I very much welcome this debate, which should clearly be about what science has to say about policy, rather than what policy has to say about science. And while I won't be voting for the Labour amendment, I would like to begin by saying that I take Ian Gray's point in our earlier exchange, that this transition that we should be trying to make from this abuse to the use of science, from policy-based evidence to evidence-based policy, if you like, it does have serious challenges for all of us. And there are times when my party, my wider movement that I feel part of, have not always taken a science-led argument. I hope that on most issues, including GM and nuclear power, he would agree that the most ardent geek activist would not argue that only scientific arguments can be put forward in those issues. Economic arguments also matter as well. But I think, as well as challenges for my party, there are challenges for all in this debate. And I would, in particular, flag up the experience of Professor David Nutt, sacked by the previous UK government simply for the crime of holding drugs policy to scientific scrutiny and challenge. A government which had, in fact, commissioned advice from the Advisory Council on the misuse of drugs after having made a decision about what it wanted to do, seeking the advice after making the decision. Presiding officer, I'd like to flag up as well to members a book which I've found very instructive in recent months, The Geek Manifesto. A book which I think perhaps Liam MacArthur may have misrecognised it as he walked into the chamber. It is a book, and it is orange, but it's not that one. I'll maybe give that a go one day. It's one which seeks to articulate the political objectives of a movement which has grown up, which could, if it plays its cards right, become one of the most significant single-issue campaigns to have developed in recent years. A group focused on the role of science in policy. It's got a great deal to offer in terms of constructive suggestions. Marco Biaggi mentioned randomised control trials, and the book goes into great detail about the ways in which these are fundamentally different from the pilot schemes that we run on existing policies. The challenges there would be in actually randomising a controlled trial of education policy, for example. But is it any less justified to take a randomised controlled trial approach and actually generate data that's useful than it is to impose a new policy because we think, finger in the air, it's probably going to work, and then finding out later that we have to run an assessment to justify the policy rather than to find out the information. At heart, this book and this agenda is seeking scientific input before decisions are made, whether on climate change, the wider environment, transport, health. I think Stuart Stevenson mentioned the alcohol debate, and that's one that we've had quite poorly conducted in this Parliament, I would argue, with last-minute amendments being proposed from the Chamber to the last licensing bill, based on political posturing rather than on the years of consultation and evidence that had been taken forward. And in the last session, where we saw the unedifying spectacle of both the government and the opposition putting forward useful and constructive suggestions for changes to alcohol policy, and arguing against each other's policy suggestions each without the clear weight of evidence behind them. I give way.
I'm very grateful to Patrick Harvey for giving way. Would he accept that in terms of developing the evidence, there's also an exercise in conditioning the public environment? And actually, if you were to take an example of smoking in public places, had a government that sought to bring that in 3, 4, 5 years beforehand, it's very likely that it would not have been the success it ultimately was.
Patrick Harvey.
I agree very much, and he comes on to something that I was about to begin to speak about, which is the public acceptance of these arguments, and the public attitude to these arguments is conditioned far more by the media than by what we do in parliamentary debates. And there are examples, far too many examples, of science abuse in the media, whether in terms of climate change. You know, I wonder, maybe James Delingpole is one of Murdo Fraser's favourite columnists on the issue of climate change, but clearly someone who is guilty of repeatedly pushing deliberately distorted arguments on climate change. Not just a political challenge, but deliberate distortions.
Last minute.
The similar examples can be found in relation to drugs policy, sexual health and a range of other issues. We're not as bad in this country, Deputy Presiding Officer, as the US, where the tactics being used, which were developed by the tobacco industry to argue against public health measures, are now used to argue against the teaching of evolution and are used indeed to undermine climate science. But even in this Parliament, and even in this afternoon's discussions, we've heard an Energy Minister emphasise the role of evidence in relation to unconventional gas, but then refuse to join the dots. The evidence is abundantly clear that we have far more fossil fuels than we can afford to burn, and yet government after government after government seeks to run a high-carbon, low-carbon energy policy. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this debate, and I commend the GEEP manifesto, which is available from the Spice Library for any member who wants to take a look.
Thank you. I now call Willie Coffey to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to make some contribution to this debate. When I tell anyone who asks me that I'm an honours graduate of computer science, I usually get a strange look, as if to say, what on earth are you doing here in the Scottish Parliament? And regrettably, I'm still getting that look from some colleagues around the table today. But seriously, the look of surprise in people's faces tells me something about attitudes to science and where it is thought it rightly belongs. And that attitude towards science is one we should all strive to change, to invite the public to engage with science and as policy makers to put science centre stage in what we do. That wonderful professor of science, Carl Sagan, once said that we live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. My own journey with science began as a youngster with my fascination with the moon landings in 1969. And I was fortunate to be able to highlight those events in a recent members' debate in tribute to Neil Armstrong. Within a few years, I was lucky enough to be studying computer science at Strathclyde University. Way back then, hardly anybody that I knew anything about computers and the impact they were to have in our changing world, but I wanted to be a part of it anyway, to see where it took me. And I think Professor Sagan was right about science being a bit of an unknown to most people in our society. I'm grateful to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for their briefing paper to members, which also tells us that much more scientific knowledge exists outside than within government. We probably all knew that, but good progress, I believe, is being made, both here in Scotland and within the European Union. The Science for Scotland strategy, which was launched in 2008, underpins much of the work currently going on in Scotland to place science more at the heart of what we do, aimed at individuals and encouraging greater awareness and participation in science, supporting scientific research, fostering more partnerships between business and academia, and of course reaching out to develop Scotland's role as a key player in science internationally. Members have already highlighted the respected role that Scotland has gained in research citations around the world and the increasing number of international collaborations taking place with countries like Germany, France, China and the USA. Looking to Europe, as has already been mentioned, it's very encouraging to note that Professor Anne Glover was appointed to the European Commission's, as the European Commission's first ever Chief Scientific Advisor, following on from her similar role for the Scottish Government. The Horizon 2020 programme that members may well be aware of, which is attempting to both simplify and nurture research and innovation capabilities and be a real driver for jobs and growth in Europe, will be a huge test of the European Union's ability to apply scientific knowledge directly and positively to affect the kind of societal change that most of us, I think, would want to see. I was fortunate to have met Professor Glover a few years ago at one of the many science festivals taking place in Dynamic Earth, and look forward to the developing an influential role for her as one of Scotland's top scientists at the heart of European policy making. Presiding Officer, a little bit perhaps in a local focus, I've had the privilege to see the emergence of a new engineering and science society in Kilmarnock, established by Professor Danny Gorman just last year. The whole idea for this came from a conference held at Kilmarnock College, resulting from discussions on science engagement, or the lack of it at the time, and the desire to promote a greater interest in science amongst our pupils. I'm delighted to say that the Society is going from strength to strength, having already had 5 major lectures from scientists such as Professor Colin McInnes, who spoke on advanced space concepts, Dr Dan Kirkwood on the new materials emerging, Suzanne Flynn, who talked about her experience in aerospace engineering, and Professor Martin Hendry, who gave us a fantastic lecture on gravitational waves. And in the new year, we are to hear from Dr Victoria Martin of Edinburgh University, and who, coincidentally, is also from Kilmarnock, who will tell us about her work in searching for the Higgs boson particle and its implications for the origins of the universe. The point, of course, is that all of the presenters and members of that society are meeting to promote science and engineering, in that particular case, to further the public interest in science and to influence public policy. One of our local champions of the society is a local teacher, Colin Barber, who is Principal Teacher of Physics at St Joseph's Academy in Kilmarnock, and who recently won the Institute of Physics Teacher of the Year Award for 2012. So one of the comments that I note from Sir Peter Knight about physics driving the Scottish economy and Scotland leading the UK in this regard is both appropriate and encouraging. Finally, Presiding Officer, I think Scotland has a long and impressive history of scientific contributions which have made the world a much better place to live in. The new challenges, though, that we face in world population, climate change, energy, food production and economic prosperity are all areas in which you will find Scottish scientists making an important contribution. In my view, we are placing science more at the heart of what we do, and perhaps if Professor Sagan had lived a few more years, he would change his view and begin to see that science and scientists are everywhere, even at the heart of government. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Neil Bibby to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's important we use this opportunity today not just to recognise the important role that scientific evidence plays in terms of forming public policy, but also the importance of science and research in Scotland as a whole. It's also important to recognise the challenges that the sector faces, particularly in relation to the under-representation of women, and that's where I want to start my remarks. Presiding Officer, I agree with the Scottish Government when they point to the importance of engaging with the public in relation to the science that underpins policy. I would make the point, though, that as a starting point for this, we should be focusing on engaging the public, and particularly women in science in general. As members have pointed out, the number of female graduates in science, technology, engineering and maths subjects has increased in recent years, and this is, of course, welcome. I hope this is a trend that we see continue in the future. However, this should not distract us from the reality that women are still underrepresented at every level of STEM education and careers. It is clear that for women in science, the glass ceiling still exists. In the report, Tapping All Our Talents, Women in Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths, published earlier this year, the Royal Society of Edinburgh stated that in universities, women are lost at every level of the academic career structure. They also continue to be underrepresented in top posts. The report highlighted the loss of qualified female scientists to both the public and the private sector in Scotland. This represents not only a loss of individual opportunity, but a cost to the Scottish economy as well. The report states, Scotland fails to realise the potential of its research base and will continue to do so if it systematically fails to cope with the debilitating loss of talent represented by the high attrition rate of highly trained women from employment. I think these words are key in outlining the challenge that we face. It is concerning to hear that 73% of female graduates are lost from STEM careers. This is in comparison to under half of male graduates. We therefore do need to ask why this is and examine the reasons that female graduates are discouraged from pursuing a career in their field of study. Professor Anne Glover, who has been well quoted today, also highlighted some important points when asked about the issues for women in science that need tackling. She pointed to the difficulty of combining a family life and working in science. She spoke about the importance of encouraging employers to think about how female-friendly their environment is. Professor Glover points to flexibility as being a key issue, allowing meetings and work to be tailored around childcare arrangements. Job sharing and keeping women in touch with workplaces when on maternity leave are other relatively simple things that can make a positive difference. I'm sure everyone in this chamber is supportive of such steps, and it's vital that significant steps are taken to foster the kind of work-life balance in the science sector that allows and encourages women to pursue a career in this field. Presiding Officer, many members this afternoon have highlighted the importance our universities have in terms of science and research, and I don't think this can be overstated. Our universities have a long and proud history of research, innovation and discovery, and as Neil Finlay and others have said, one of the many benefits of being part of the UK is that Scottish universities receive a large amount of funding from UK bodies. Indeed, Scotland punches above its weight when it comes to competing for UK research funding. Scottish researchers continue to work collaboratively with leading researchers from across the UK. We only have to look at the world-famous example of Dolly the sheep that was mentioned earlier, the world's first successfully cloned mammal ever to be created from an adult cell, to see the success such working together has brought. The Rosalind Institute in Edinburgh, where Dolly sheep was created, brings together experts from across the UK and receives substantial funding from the UK Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. We should aim to build on this already successful partnership by making collaboration easier, not more difficult. I took the opportunity before this debate to look at a university in my own area, the University of the West of Scotland, which George Adam mentioned earlier, and I think it's important to note their financial figures for the academic year ending July 2011 show they received nearly £3 million in research grants and contracts. This included money from the UK Research Council, the European Commission and UK charities. This sort of funding has allowed UWS to undertake valuable research projects which can be seen on their website, and Mr Adam mentioned them earlier.
Last minute.
A lot of members have mentioned various briefings in this debate today. I noted from the Society of Biology briefing provided to the members, it highlighted the strategy for UK life sciences. This describes the importance that this sector has to the UK economy, generating turnover of £50 billion and employing 167,500 people in over 4,500 companies. It's clear from this the important role science plays in economic growth, and this is something we should all appreciate the importance of, particularly in the light of current financial circumstances. Presiding Officer, it's clear that scientific research plays a significant role right across modern life. We are rightly proud of our reputation for excellence in research and science, but there is also a need to address the significant challenges that we face. We can and should address these challenges here in Scotland while maintaining our status as a world leader in research as part of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to be speaking in this debate today, not only as a member of the Scottish Parliament, but also as a member of the cross-party group on science and technology and a member of the British Computer Society. And I would like to put on record my thanks to the partners of the cross-party group who have contributed to their briefings for the debate today. It's been very helpful. I was a bit perturbed at the direction the debate seemed to be taking, and also the Labour motion, because like Patrick Harvey, I thought that this would be a debate focusing very much on scientific evidence. So if I could first deal with the Labour amendment and the issue of funding and what they have said about funding in an independent Scotland. And I find this really quite concerning because, of course, Scotland contributes to the Fund for Research at the moment, and it seems to be that if it's got UK attached to it, somehow Scotland hasn't contributed to that fund in the first place. And if you actually look at Scotland as has been used by the Labour Party, looking at it on a population basis, Scotland contributes more to the British economy on a population basis than it actually gets back. And if you look at the OECD figures that would put Scotland sixth in terms of wealth as an independent nation, the idea that somehow scientific funding could possibly be reduced or threatened in an independent Scotland is just, in my mind, absurd. And no, I'm sorry, I'm very tight for time, last speaker, sorry. If I could also speak a little bit about the concerns raised about women in science, and I do say this somewhat ironically as one of those who has left the scientific professions to pursue a different career, but I do believe that tackling this is a societal problem. It's an endemic in society. Gender pay gap plays a large part in this issue, and if we're really to tackle gender inequality in STEM professions, we must tackle gender inequality, pay differentials, establish working practices that impinge on family life for both men, women and carers throughout society. These problems are not unique to the STEM areas. In my own profession, the British Computer Society has said that there's a significant pay gap within only 15 months of graduation between men and women computing graduates, and this is just untenable. And a lot of people have talked about the tapping all the talents, and I do note that tapping all the talents in the issues that looks at what the Scottish Government can do are mainly about what we are trying to tackle in terms of childcare provision, or procurement policy, or gender pay gap, and all of these issues are looking towards improving this issue. And also, Anne Glover, in her article in The Biologist recently, did speak about this issue, and she also says that it's an issue for men in sciences as well. It's part of the traditional way in which the scientific research community has developed, and all the working practices are hard on all family life, not just on women within the organisation. Can I also talk about Anne Glover and the quote that Fiona MacLeod used about evidence base, and saying that politicians can't interfere with the evidence, but they can decide not to use it. And it's been the case. I mean, if we go back to maybe the case of Galileo, who was putting forward the theories of Copernicus, which he believed he proved that indeed the Earth was not the centre of the universe, and of course, going against the perceived wisdom at the time, he paid a really high price for that, first being condemned to death and then put into exile for the remainder of his life. And Fiona MacLeod, as librarian, will be interested to know that I was at the National Library of Scotland exhibition on banned books last year, and one of those banned books was where Darwin's grandfather had first put down the initial stages of what evolution theory might become, and what was taken up by his grandson and published in The Origin of the Species. So we don't often get the policy and the scientific perceived wisdom and where we are together. And I think part of that is that we have a long way to go in the language of science and how that is used. And we need to build more confidence and better understanding of this in this chamber. Not today, I have to say. I've heard people saying that Alexander Fleming invented penicillin, which of course he didn't, he discovered it. And it's these small things and understandings about science that are really, really important to us. And I think this would go some way to what I want to say about what Murders Fraser's contribution was, that actually putting the word theory behind something does not make it indeed a scientific theory of merit. And I think this is particularly important in the area of eugenics. And I'm a bit younger than some of the people that might be inspired at the moment by Anne Glover or Brian Cox, but one of my inspirations in science was Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner in physics and theoretical physicist. And he said, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or another. And I would say eugenics far from matches that standard set by him. I'll just finish by also saying that Richard Feynman said in his area of science, if you have a theory, you must try to explain what's good and what's bad about it equally. In science, you learn a kind of standard integrity and honesty. And I hope that today we will take away our confidence in the standard integrity and honesty of the scientists who are advising our government on policy.
Thank you. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Alex Johnson. You have up to 7 minutes, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I begin by offering my apologies to yourself and to the rest of the Chamber for missing the opening speeches in this debate. Unfortunately, I had a meeting with the Education Minister, who, as we saw, was here opening the debate. It's fascinating how we can all pull and push in different directions and yet all end up in the right place at the right time. Perhaps an example to us as to how we might use science. On the issue of science, as it's raised in this debate today, I was actually delighted to see this government come forward with a debate that was designed to highlight the opportunities that science actually affords us here in Scotland. Because, as has been pointed out on numerous occasions during the course of this debate, Scotland is a country that punches well above its weight when it comes to scientific research. Yet, we do have a problem, and that is that too often we've allowed public opinion, sometimes public opinion manifest in political parties' policy, to be the judge of right and wrong as when we decide how we will exploit technologies that are available to us. I remember some years ago when a young man by the name of Tommy Docherty was at that time working for British Nuclear Fuels Limited, and he and I took the opportunity to visit a number of universities to participate in debates on the future of nuclear power. Tommy and I were always on the same side, I'm sure you realise. But anyway, the experience we had was that as we went around the universities, if we went to the universities that were more traditional and more arty in their background, if we had a vote at the end of the debate, we got gubbed. However, if we went to the new universities, Strathclyde and RGU, for example, at the end of the debate, if there was a vote, we won comfortably. And it was because in these new universities that encouraged technology and encouraged scientific education, there was a much broader view to that technology. And yet, we have a government today that is quite determined to ignore the opportunities that nuclear power offer this country, and to do so on the basis of an understanding, or perhaps lack of understanding of the science, which sadly makes me worry for the future of technology in Scotland. No, I think I will continue at this time. I didn't want to talk about nuclear power too much. I will move ahead by saying that it is sadly an example of how a particular branch of science has gone down the political agenda and down the priority lists in Scotland in recent years. But what I wanted to do before I come to a close was to move on to the issue of genetic engineering. Now, genetic manipulation is something that I have a lot of personal experience of, because as a farmer, I was involved in breeding livestock and crops and trying to improve generation upon generation. So, genetic manipulation is something that none of us should be afraid of. It's something that's been happening for generations. In fact, in this country, we have a record of doing some very interesting things when it comes to manipulating genes. If you look at the barley that's used to produce Scotland's whisky today, much of the crops that are grown are of varieties that can trace their history back to an experiment conducted in the 1950s, where barley seed was put in a nuclear pile and irradiated. And after that experiment, much of that grain was found to be dead. Some of it was able to be grown on. Some of that grew was able to demonstrate characteristics that exceeded that of the parent crop. And by doing so, we produced a generation of crops that have sustained Scottish agriculture since that time and up to the present day. While I have in the past described this government's resistance to GM technology as being an embarrassment to them, I think I once accused Mike Russell of being a Puritan and a Luddite, we need to get a firm understanding of what the science actually means, and I think that's what lies at the very heart of this debate today. I will, very briefly.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. Does he accept that there is nothing unscientific about advancing an argument in relation to GM technology which is based on the economics of a technique which can only be deployed by multinationals to transfer the control of agriculture from smallholders and independent farmers to themselves?
Alec Johnston.
I understand what the member means. However, he has misunderstood what has happened in relation to GM technology. The Terminator gene, for example, was originally developed to ensure that crops could not be grown on beyond a single generation. And the fact that it also gave those who possessed the genetic or who possessed the intellectual property the opportunity to limit its use was something which he rightly complains of, but that is not core to the technology. Similarly, the development of resistance to specific preparatory herbicides, again, was a commercial activity which is not at the core of what we do. We in Scotland, through the presence of what was formerly known as the Crop Research Institute at Invergowrie, were world leaders in the development of genetically modified crops and had the opportunity to present our farmers and those the world over with the crops they needed to feed another generation. If we had been allowed to concentrate on achieving the key successes that our farmers the world over await, then we might by now have seen the drought-resistant wheat that would get us away from the problem of periodic famines. We might have seen salt-tolerant rice, which would allow us to grow our crops on the coastal plains. We might have seen frost-resistant maize, which would enable farmers here in Scotland to be massively more productive. And if we in Scotland do turn our backs on genetically modified crops and someone somewhere develops a blight-resistant potato, then our potato industry will come to a sad and quick end. Professor John Hillman, who was a friend of mine and who was the director of the Crop Research Institute, is one of those who has an expertise level that is well beyond that of many in the science, and we have missed the opportunity to exploit the opportunity that these men like John Hillman and the technology that they and their staff developed. We in this country have had the opportunity to develop new sciences. We've had the opportunity to make biotechnology our heavy industry of the 21st century, but we have a government that cannot buck public opinion.
Thank you. And I call on you, Henry, around 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I commend the Cabinet Secretary for Education in being able to step in at short notice for Alistair Allen. I did think, however, listening to his opening remarks, that he possibly had picked up the wrong set of notes, because when he said, when we don't know, we ask someone else, I thought he was about to talk about college funding. But, clearly he then went on to focus on the topic of the debate. Now, I actually come from a generation that maybe was scarred by science teaching. I could never understand having a textbook called Physics is Fun, because there was nothing that I discovered in the learning of physics in my school that was anywhere near fun. And yet, certainly.
Stuart Stevenson.
Never had the immense pleasure of being charged up by a Van de Graaff generator, walking down the corridor and then zapping someone else in the corridor with 1,000,000 volts. Now, how much fun do you really want?
Hugh Henry.
Do you know, I do wonder what has gone on in Stuart Stevenson's life and how he enjoys himself, but it's not for me to speculate. I did wonder, actually, when he was talking about in his school that his teacher took him round the school searching for infinity, and I thought an early Buzz Lightyear clearly had got in there first. Whether he discovered anything still remains to be seen. But no, the way that physics and science indeed was taught at that time, I think unfortunately did sour many people, and yet what we now see in our schools and what we now see with the opportunities being afforded through Curriculum for Excellence is an imaginative way of stimulating interest and actually allowing our youngsters to see the relevance of science and indeed experience the joy of learning. Because one of the things that came out during the course of the debate was when we referred back to Scotland's history of scientific achievement through many notable individuals. I think we realised that if Scotland is to succeed in the 21st century, we actually need to breed and develop that new generation of scientists that would enable us to play a similar role today. And that has got to start at a young age. And at a young age, people have got to understand the value and significance of science, because there is no point in talking about science shaping policy development if we have a population that doesn't see the value of science in itself. And, you know, I still think we've got huge ways to go, because when I was listening to the exchange between Marco Biagi and Ian Gray about Karl Popper, I reflected that for many in Edinburgh and Glasgow, when you talk about Popper, you're not talking about eminent philosophers, you're talking about something completely different. Because much of this debate today, learned though it is, actually would pass by many people. And we've got to ask ourselves, why is it that science and the value of science still fails to touch so many people? Now, I think most people would agree today that you need data, you need research, and you need evidence. And we should listen to and be advised by scientists. But as many people have also said, ultimately it has got to be politicians who will make the decisions. And hopefully they would make those decisions wisely. But I thought Helen Eadie made an interesting point, because when she was talking about the experience in Dalgety Bay, she talked about how some scientists had been hugely dismissive of the early evidence. And that just goes to prove that sometimes it's the context in which science does its work and in which information is delivered that can be the ultimate determinant. And if we don't create the political culture and the political environment where scientists feel free to be able to challenge information and to interrogate evidence, then we will still be at a loss as a society. Because I think now what's beginning to come out in Dalgety Bay, through some of the good work from scientists, shows that there has been a long-standing problem there. Now, it's undoubtedly the case that, as in many aspects of Scottish life, we still have too few women engaged at the top levels. And Neil Findlay and others have spoken about the need to make sure that women are encouraged into the debate on science. And I thought Ian Gray, in an excellent contribution, made a worthy contribution about the suggestion of a council of scientific advisers. Because if we can have a council of economic advisers, then surely a council of scientific advisers would be worthy of consideration. And I think also there were a number of contributions during the course of the debate, and there was mention made of MMR. And of course, the whole debate and discussion on MMR was a warning about politicians actually ignoring scientific evidence in debate, and indeed politicians in this Parliament actually doing no service to the communities and the individuals that they represented in shunning much of the scientific debate that was there. And the tragedy is the human damage that can be caused when politicians wantonly ignore the evidence simply to make political points. So hopefully, if anything has come out of the debate today, then it can be a caution and a warning to us all. And indeed, I would dispute some of what Fiona MacLeod was saying about the evidence on the alcohol debate in the Sheffield study. There was one model there, but yet many scientists and economists would challenge much of the evidence that the Sheffield model brought forward. No, thank you. I'm just about to conclude. So we should always be cautious about how we use information, but we should never be scared of seeking out information and advice, but then make sure that we use it wisely and in the proper context. So, this has been a good debate. It's been an interesting debate, and for someone who doesn't have a scientific background, it's actually been a very informative one. But I would just end by repeating what I had said earlier on, and that is that despite the progress that we have made over many generations in science in Scotland, we have reached a situation today where we cannot afford to rest on our laurels, and there is a danger that if we don't encourage, promote and advance scientific endeavour, then this country and this society will be the loser for that.
I now call on Dr Alistair Allen to wind up the debate. Dr Allen, you have until just before 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I must apologise firstly, as others have done for me, for my lateness here. As my plane sat on the runway on Inverness Airport, it did cross my mind that perhaps one of the things that science could contribute usefully to my life would be a teleport, or failing that, perhaps some jump leads I could carry about with me. This has been a very interesting debate which has drawn out a wide variety of contributions. In response to a remark Mr Fraser made, I am unable to say, arriving when I did, whether Mr Russell picked up the speech I intended to deliver, so I won't try and refer to it. But it has been particularly good to have had interest from the learned societies in this debate, who are important contributors on evidence for public policy, not just through their formal papers and their support of the annual Science in the Parliament debate, but also through their informative newsletter and their updates regularly on current science stories and events. They also produce some interesting reports. The Institute of Physics launched Physics, the Key to Thriving Scottish Economy in this building in October, and it showed that Scotland has performed better than the other nations of these islands. We have in this debate, I think, largely agreed today on the importance of scientific evidence in informing decision-making, and further demonstrated how the evidence comes from the hard work and dedication of scientists and engineers from all walks of life, wherever they work. Referring, as I'll try to do just now, to some of the speakers who've contributed, and again beginning with Mr Fraser, I'm not really quite sure where he was headed with some of his arguments about global warming, about which he did strike me as being rather sceptical, and I did feel that some of his comparisons with eugenics were a little far-fetched. However, it is certainly legitimate that all of us in this chamber and elsewhere scrutinise and interrogate science, and that, of course, said, Mr Fraser did seem to argue against his own position slightly in his comments about GM. And it's worth adding in that respect that although the Scottish Government doesn't support GM trials, the Scottish Government does support wider crop research to the tune of £8 million a year. But, as I say, largely the Parliament was agreed on the importance of having access to independent advice from both the Chief Scientific Advisers and the Scottish Science Advisory Council. Certainly.
Brian Adam.
The important question that scientific advice can answer, or at least go somewhere answering, is it a coincidence, or is there a causal link, which is quite often very hard to give a definitive answer to.
Dr Allen.
I appreciate the distinction which the member makes about the distinction between the warming of the earth and the presence of a man-made factor behind that, although I do feel that the overwhelming scientific consensus is that there is a man-made human agency behind the rise in the temperature of the earth and indeed the sea. It should be said that while each of the independent advisers have a large remit of their own, there is potentially considerable added value in them coordinating their advice. Regular meetings are being arranged between them to start in the new year. I already meet regularly with Professor Calder, and meetings in future will include updates of these combined discussions. And to answer a point raised by Mr Gray and Mr MacArthur about the First Minister is also arranging to meet with the Scottish Science Advisory Council as part of his continuing commitment to regular engagement. And only a few days ago, indeed, the First Minister was in my constituency meeting with the scientific community there in the work they are engaged on in developing various areas of research around the development of omega-3. I will.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to the Minister taking intervention. Well, I welcome the engagement that he suggested there. I wonder whether he would be able to respond to the suggestion that Ian Gray and I think a number of others have made about having a council of scientific advisers in much the same way as we have a council of economic advisers.
Minister.
Well, there is, of course, the Scottish Science Advisory Council in existence, which does advise the Government, and I certainly believe that advice is taken seriously. The recognition that exists, I believe, of the importance of engaging with the public in relation to the science that underpins all policy is certainly given the importance which it merits. Mr Adam mentions... I'll have to make some progress before I take further interventions. Mr Adam mentioned, along with Mr Adam mentions the science centres in Scotland and the science festivals, and managed to get them mentioned in a speech which had an impressive number of name checks for Paisley. I believe that, Presiding Officer, it's worth also remembering the work that can be done with young people and the wider public, which can help the government scientists develop valuable new skills and provide a new perspective on their role. I know from being at the Scottish Government Science and Engineering Profession Annual Conference last month that this fits in with the work of the Profession Board in supporting the career paths of Scottish Government scientists themselves. Part of the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor is to act as head of profession and to ensure the continued quality of the evidence by encouraging peer review and continued professional development amongst government scientists. If I could turn to the amendment from Neil Findlay and that from Murdo Fraser, the amendment regarding greater focus on promoting STEM subjects and presenting the advantages of STEM careers being proposed by Mr Fraser. It is, of course, vitally important to attract young people into careers in science, engineering and technology. Apart from anything else, it is a good degree to have, as the employment rate from STEM degrees is 84%. The Curriculum for Learning approach will help ensure that pupils at all stages can explore the real-life relevance of science, and I believe for the reasons I have already described, that the greater focus he is looking for is already underway, and for that reason I can happily accept the amendment. Many members rightly referred to women in science. It was pointed to by Neil Findlay, Ian Gray, Neil Bibby and others. And it's interesting that even in a subject such as biology, where women traditionally outnumber men at undergraduate level, industry and academia still have difficulty retaining this highly trained talent. The Royal Society of Edinburgh produced an informative report on this earlier this year, and since then we have held Scotland's first employment summit for women, launched the new £250,000 Career-Wise initiative aimed at encouraging more young women to consider careers in the fields of science, and have committed to funding the Scottish Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology. The issues that were raised around constitutional change were interesting. Scotland's excellence in the field of science holds true regardless of future constitutional changes. Our universities are arguably the strongest part of Scotland's science heritage. Now, of course, it's a legitimate debate to have at the time that we have leading up to the referendum, and that debate will happen, I'm sure, within the academic community. I'm not sure what the relevance is of Dr Simpson's remarks about the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty. They presently evade me, but there will, as I say, be discussion around some of the broader issues. And with this in mind, the Scottish Government will ensure continued... Since I've named them, yeah.
Dr Simpson.
The ERA was a member of the Medical Research Council for 2 years after they became independent, after which their membership of the Medical Research Council was dropped, after which the Wellcome Foundation reduced its funding for any project from ERA to 50% instead of 100%. That's the point.
Minister?
Well, firstly, I'm tempted to say that the world has moved on slightly, but I think it provides the opportunity to say that there seems to be an assumption on the part of some members on that side of the chamber that the Scottish Government only has one model in mind when it comes to potential funding models for Scotland after independence. There are, of course, many models, and there are, of course, many countries which share research councils, and I think it's worth that being borne in mind. And I think I have to return to the issue which has been raised a number of times in this debate, which is about the just return, as it were, and how Scotland gets more than her just return on academic research funding. The reason Scotland does so is not because of any political decision to kill Scotland with kindness. It does so because Scotland is excellent in the field of scientific research. This Parliament today has probably learned that we don't probably give enough attention to the subject of science in our deliberations, so I would therefore encourage all of you to take up opportunities as they are presented to you to engage with scientists and all those connected in science to celebrate their work and achievements. As I sat in the plane today, I was also rather worried that I would miss out on hearing Renaissance Man in the form of Mr Stuart Stevenson. He did not disappoint, and the Van de Graaff generator was an interesting contribution to the debate, but coming from a man who has in the past, rather to my fear, asked me parliamentary questions about algebra, it does not come as a surprise. I could sum up by talking about all the various contributions from members. There were very many learned and helpful contributions. I can only find time to quote one, and that was Mr Henry, who said that his personality and outlook on life was scarred by physics. I have to say, in defence, this is one thing for which physics should not have to take responsibility in human history. Fundamentally, though, I do believe that this Chamber united today, and that the purpose of this debate was to show how important the decision-making process is and how scientific evidence is an essential part of it. And for those reasons, and many others, I therefore invite you to support the motion.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy. Point of order, Lewis MacDonald.
I would like to raise a point of order under Rule 13.5.2. On the 9th of October, after Donald Trump had published an email sent to him by a special adviser seeking endorsement of the decision to release the Lockerbie bomber, I asked a number of specific parliamentary questions to establish whether the Scottish Government had sent emails to other individuals or organisations seeking endorsement of that decision. On the 5th of November, I received a holding reply from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, which promised a full reply to my questions as soon as possible. On the 6th of December last week, the Scottish Government published on its website a number of emails sent by special advisers in the First Minister's office in response to a Freedom of Information request from a newspaper, which contained precisely the information I had asked for. The information was then published in newspapers on the 7th of December, but I received answers to these questions only yesterday, on the 10th of December. I am disappointed that the Government chose not to answer my specific questions, but instead published the information separately, some 8 weeks after I had tabled the questions, and some 4 weeks after I was promised replies as soon as possible. Mr McCaskill's answer to question S4M-05145 assured me that copies of the relevant correspondence were being placed that same day on the Scottish Government website, when they had in fact been published several days earlier. And the answer was provided after 46 days rather than after 20 days, as laid down in standing orders. Presiding Officer, you ruled on a point of order raised by Mark Griffin last week, and you said that the Scottish Government should not treat members with such discourtesy in the future. I ask now that you use your authority to ensure there are no further such occurrences, and that the Scottish Government should answer all questions promptly in accordance with standing orders, no matter how embarrassing their answers may be.
I thank the member for his point of order. When I spoke last week about courtesy and respect for the Parliament, I expected that to apply to all members of the Parliament and not just to government members. I am therefore disappointed to learn that Mr MacDonald's point of order has been circulated to the press in advance of it being raised first in this chamber. I made my position clear last week in response to Mark Griffin's point of order, and I understand that the Minister for Parliamentary Business, who was initially made aware of Mr MacDonald's point of order from the press, wishes to respond.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yes, it was through the press that we were alerted to this point of order. I can therefore confirm that a number of FOIs were received by the Government on the 8th of October from various sources. The PQs from Lewis MacDonald were received one day later on the 9th of October. The FOIs were answered on Friday the 7th of December. The PQs were answered one working day later on Monday the 10th of December.
There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 5154.2 in order in the name of Neil Findlay, which seeks to amend motion number 5154 in the name of Alistair Allen on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5154.2 in the name of Neil Findlay is as follows. Yes, 52. No, 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 5154.1 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend motion number 5154 in the name of Alistair Allen on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5154 in the name of Alistair Allen as amended on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. I would ask members who are leaving the chamber now to do so quietly.